reawakening because they were political,
Yeah.
they were artistic collaborators. My mother ran a theater and cooked the breakfast and knew where we all were.
Paul Newman was Hollywood's golden boy. On screen, he was the dream husband, the blue-eyed heartthrob every woman wanted. Off-screen, he played the part of a devoted family man. But behind closed doors, there was another Paul, the one who craved the touch of men as much as women. For decades, he hid that truth, slipping in and out of affairs with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. And only years later, his own daughter finally said it out loud. Join us as we uncover the names of the gay actors Paul Newman dated secretly. Beginning of an obsession. Beginning of an obsession. Paul's secret life didn't begin in Hollywood. It started much earlier, back in high school, where he quietly experimented with other boys. By the time he came home from the Navy in 1946, he was no stranger to men. At 21, he enrolled at Kenyon College, an all-male school in Ohio, and there the pattern deepened. It was during those college years that Paul first heard the name Marlon. One of his professors came back from New York raving about a new Broadway play, A Streetcar Named Desire, and about the young actor who made the stage feel alive. That actor was Marlon Brando. The professor said anyone serious about acting had to see him. Paul couldn't get the idea out of his head. He was restless, hungry for more than Ohio could give him. So with a few dollars in his pocket, he hopped a train to New York. He checked into the YMCA and set out to see as many plays as his money would allow. But there was only one that mattered. He bought a standing room ticket for Streetcar. Packed into the back of the theater, he craned his neck and waited. And then Marlon walked on stage. What Paul saw that night was more than acting. Marlon wasn't just performing, he was raw electricity, a storm in human form. His body moved with a kind of danger, and his voice carried a force that pulled everyone closer. Paul watched with wide eyes, feeling both admiration and something deeper. Marlon was what he wanted to be and what he wanted to have. From that moment, Marlon became an obsession.
Here's some hot coffee for you. I guess you can use it after last night, huh? Oh, what a...
A few years later, Paul was at the actor's studio, moving in the same world as his idol. By then, Paul had grown into his looks, those piercing blue eyes, the sculpted face, the kind of beauty that turned heads the moment he walked into a room. And finally, he was close enough to Marlon to be noticed. Paul hung around Marlon, followed him into rooms, and lingered at parties where he knew Marlon would be. And Marlon, who had never been shy about testing boundaries, took him in. In private, what started as admiration slipped into something physical. Marlon was magnetic, and Paul was hooked. But Marlon also had the upper hand. They looked alike. They were often compared. Yet Paul was always in his shadow, as an actor, as a man, and even in bed. The affair was intoxicating and cruel at the same time. Paul wanted Marlon, but he also wanted to beat him, to escape the feeling of being second. Still, he couldn't resist. With Marlon, he learned just how deep his desire for men went, and just how dangerous it could feel. This was the start of Paul's double life. In public, the promising young actor, polite and ambitious. In private, a man drawn into Marlon Brando's orbit, tasting a world he would never admit out loud. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back, because waiting just ahead was another dangerous name, James Dean. Dangerous Liaisons. When Paul walked into the actor's studio in New York, he wasn't just there to learn about acting. He was stepping into a charged world where ambition mixed with lust, and where the lines between rivalry, friendship, and intimacy blurred every night. Among the hungry young faces, two men would stand out for Paul, James and Monty. James Dean was the first, and he wasn't polished yet. He was restless, moody, and magnetic in a way that felt dangerous. James didn't act like he cared about Hollywood, yet he wanted it more than anyone. His eyes carried rebellion, his body language dared you to come closer, and Paul couldn't look away. They connected quickly. Both were students, both competitive, and both hiding secrets they didn't fully have words for. Their attraction wasn't tender, it was messy and urgent, the kind of thing that happened when two young men were trying to outdo each other but ended up in each other's arms. Nights together were wild, intense, a mix of sex and challenge. James lived recklessly, though. He sped down streets, smoked too much, drank too hard, and loved in the same way, fast and without safety nets. For Paul, raised in a more reserved Midwestern mold, James was both thrilling and terrifying. He wanted him, but he also feared him. The relationship burned bright, but it couldn't last. James didn't stick to rules, not on screen, not behind the wheel, not in bed. Paul knew if he clung too tightly, he'd be dragged down with him. And then came Monty. Montgomery Clift was already a star when Paul entered his orbit. He was older, famous, and openly flirtatious. Where James was reckless energy, Monty was a storm cloud. He would be vulnerable one moment and domineering the next. He had no problem making the first move. He reached for Paul, touched him in ways that left no doubt about his intentions. The passion was undeniable, but so was the cruelty. Monty's tortured soul bled into everything. His acting, his drinking, his relationships.
And your mother? I trust she's well. We've never met, you know, but I've heard her mentioned from time to time, and she wrote...
And still, Paul stayed. There was something about Monty's vulnerability, his brokenness, that trapped him. He could be harsh one night, then look at Paul with pleading, wounded eyes the next. It was confusing, addictive, and it left Paul both shaken and deeply marked. Together, James and Monty taught Paul lessons he'd never forget. From James, he learned the thrill of living without restraint. Monty felt the sting of surrendering to someone else's power. Both relationships were dangerous, unstable, but they opened doors Paul couldn't close again. These weren't simple affairs. They were entanglements that shaped how Paul saw himself, how he understood his desire for men, and how he moved through the underground Hollywood world he was only just beginning to enter. And it wouldn't stop there, because the next names to cross his path, Anthony and Sal, would push him deeper into that hidden circle, where passion and danger went hand in hand. Hollywood's hidden circle. By the early 1950s, Paul had slipped into a world most moviegoers never saw. Hollywood glittered on the surface, red carpets, studio contracts, polite smiles for photographers. But behind closed doors was another circle, one filled with coded glances, whispered invitations, and late-night meetings where men who couldn't speak their truths found each other anyway. It was in that world that Paul became close to Anthony Perkins and Sal Mineo. Anthony was the first. He had learned early that Hollywood rewarded charm but punished honesty, so he perfected a boyish, awkward act while quietly pursuing men behind the scenes. When he met Paul, the attraction was quick. Paul, with his calm intensity, balanced Anthony's energy. They shared nights, sometimes tender, sometimes desperate, both of them caught between desire and fear of discovery. For Anthony, Paul's steady presence felt like safety. For Paul, Anthony was someone who mirrored his own need to keep secrets while still reaching for connection. It wasn't love, not really, but it was intimate, and it bound them inside that hidden circle. Sal Mineo was different. He was younger, wilder, a rising star who had already tasted fame from Rebel Without a Cause. Sal carried a mix of innocence and boldness that drew Paul in. Once, Sal asked that they live together as a couple. When Paul rejected, he attempted suicide. Their affair was more playful, more open inside the safe confines of Hollywood's underground. Sal liked the thrill of sneaking around, of playing roles not just on screen, but in life. He could be teasing one moment, insistent the next, pushing Paul into situations that both scared and excited him. With Sal, the encounters weren't just physical, they were daring, almost like a game of how far they could go without being caught. These connections deepened Paul's role in that underground world, and as much as Paul feared exposure, he also couldn't walk away. The kiss that ignited a rivalry. Paul and Steve first crossed paths on set while making Somebody Up There Likes Me in 1956. They were two of Hollywood's most magnetic faces, and the meeting that began as friendly sparring slipped almost at once into something sharper. Conversation turned to crude banter. The banter ended with Steve closing the distance and planting an unexpected wet kiss on Paul. A kiss with tongue that broke the polite barrier between them and rewired what had been a professional acquaintance. What followed was never a neat romance. It was an attraction braided with competition. Steve was famously brash, a man who owned his rough edges and wore defiance like armor. Paul, by contrast, had the kind of beauty that invited attention and stirred desire. The two men arced toward each other and then away, pulled by both appetite and ego. Their private encounters carried the same electricity.
Would you turn out the outside light when you go? I don't want to be disturbed.
Sure, Doc.
as their public clashes. The kiss became shorthand for a relationship that was part seduction, part territorial test. Their dynamic played out off camera as much as on. Steve liked to provoke, he liked to unsettle. Paul, who could be both amused and wounded by such barbs, found himself oddly captivated. Friends later said Paul admitted to being attracted to Steve despite the friction between them. That tension, sexual and professional, made their relationship volatile. It was not simply about intimacy. It was about status, reputation, and a fragile masculinity tested behind closed doors. The circle was growing, and soon it would pull in even bigger names. Men like John Derek, whose charm and looks matched Paul's own, would push the underground into even riskier territory. John Derek and others. By the mid-1950s, Paul was no longer just a newcomer circling his idols. He had become a name of his own, moving from promising young actor to leading man material. But while the studios worked hard to polish his image as the perfect husband and heartthrob, his private life continued to drift deeper into Hollywood's underground. This was where John Derek came in. John was tall, dark, and devastatingly handsome, the kind of man whose looks alone could silence a room. He had already been labeled a ladies' man, the kind of actor who left a trail of admirers wherever he went. But behind the rumors of women, there was another side. John moved through the same shadowy spaces Paul did, the late-night gatherings, the parties that started polite and ended in tangled secrets, the unspoken world where men found each other when no one was supposed to. And while Paul's time with John Derek burned hot, it was the gossip swirling from another corner of Hollywood, the wild stories told by Shelley Winters, that would cast Paul in an even stranger light. Sinatra-Monroe Newman proposition story. The strangest story from Paul's secret life came from a night with Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe. Hollywood circles were small, and Paul found himself at a gathering where both legends were present. And the air carried that electric mix of fame and danger. Frank was bold, the kind of man who tested limits without hesitation. At some point, with Marilyn laughing nearby, Frank is said to have turned to Paul and made a proposition that the three of them together, a night that would mix beauty, power, and forbidden thrill. The story has floated through Hollywood gossip for decades. Part rumor, part whispered confession. Did Paul accept? That's the mystery. Some claimed he walked away, unwilling to risk it. Others insisted he didn't hesitate, swept into the daring energy that defined both Frank and Marilyn. Shelley Winters also confessed that she once had a threesome with Paul and Brando. It was Hollywood at its wildest, and Paul was right there in the middle. The later years and Cal Culver's claim. By the 1970s, Paul had achieved what most actors only dreamed of: an Academy Award, box office clout, and the image of a stable family man with Joanne by his side. But even as he settled into middle age, the Hollywood underground still remembered him, and whispers about his private life never completely faded. One of the more striking claims came from Cal, a gay adult film star better known under the name Casey Donovan. Cal, at the height of his fame,
jobs, anything to audition or go to. And numerous times I had seen those little ads for X-rated films, right?
Moved in circles that brushed against mainstream Hollywood. Years later, he recounted a night with Paul, describing him as passionate and unguarded. For those who had long suspected Paul's bisexuality, Cal's account was treated as confirmation. Yet, in the public eye, Paul remained untouchable. No tabloid dared to print the story while he was alive, and the mainstream press never pursued it. Paul himself worked hard to control the narrative. He avoided the reckless lifestyle that had consumed others in his underground circle. He didn't frequent gay bars openly, and he kept his affairs discreet. His marriage to Joanne became both a sanctuary and a shield. She gave him stability, but she also gave him cover, the appearance of a man entirely devoted to one woman. It was a delicate balance, one he maintained until the very end of his life. The daughter's revelation. For decades, Paul's private life remained locked away. Then came the words that shifted the story out of rumor and into something more concrete. His daughter, speaking candidly years after his death, acknowledged what many had only guessed. Paul had relationships with men. She didn't frame it as a scandal or shame, but as part of the complexity of his life. Her statement gave weight to the stories that had long circulated.
My mother would always say, noblesse oblige. Those who have give to those who do not.
Brando, Dean, Derek, Cal, they were no longer just names passed along in gossip. They became part of Paul's truth, even if he never said so himself. The daughter's revelation didn't erase his marriage to Joanne, nor did it diminish his public achievements. Instead, it revealed the double life he had managed with extraordinary discipline. Paul's story is not just about desire, but about survival in a Hollywood that demands silence. His affairs, whispered threesomes, and hidden loves reveal a life lived in shadows, yet never far from the spotlight. Which of Paul Newman's affairs shocked you the most? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.